All right, so today we're going deep. We're doing a deep dive into a book that's been generating a lot of buzz, especially in certain corners of the internet.
Yeah, it's definitely a controversial one.
We're talking about Feminist Chaos by Sophie-Marie Eve Riker. And well, let's just say she doesn't pull any punches.
No, she doesn't.
She really takes aim at a lot of the assumptions and narratives surrounding modern feminism.
And she does it in a way that's well, it's pretty provocative. She really lays out her arguments in a very direct and sometimes even confrontational way.
Yeah, and that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. Because whether you agree with her or not, she's definitely raising some important questions, questions that a lot of people are talking about, but maybe not always addressing head on.
Right. And I think that's why this book has resonated with so many people, especially those who feel like their concerns and perspectives are being ignored or even silenced by the mainstream.
You mentioned that she doesn't hold back. And I think that's one of the first things that struck me when I started reading Feminist Chaos. She comes right out and says that modern feminism has become more about power than equality.
Yeah, that's a pretty bold statement, and it's one that's sure to ruffle some feathers.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
And she doesn't just make that claim in passing. She spends a good chunk of the book laying out her argument, backing it up with historical examples, statistics, and even personal anecdotes.
And one of the things she really focuses on is this idea that feminism has adopted a kind of Marxist framework.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. What does she mean by a Marxist framework?
Well, she argues that modern feminism, particularly in its more radical forms, views gender relations as a kind of class struggle.
Okay, I'm starting to see where she's going with this. So instead of men and women working together towards equality, she's saying it's become more about women taking power from men.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. She argues that this kind of zero-sum mentality actually undermines the possibility of true equality because it creates this adversarial dynamic where one side has to lose for the other side to win.
And she uses some pretty specific examples to illustrate this point. Like she talks about how feminist groups often actively oppose shared parenting laws.
Right, even though those laws would seem to promote equality by giving both parents equal rights and responsibilities when it comes to raising their children. Riker sees this as evidence that the goal isn't really equality, but rather it's about securing advantages for women, even if it means disadvantaging men.
It's interesting because on the surface, advocating for shared parenting seems perfectly in line with the idea of gender equality. But she's suggesting that the motivations behind some of these feminist movements might be more complex than they appear.
That's right. And she doesn't shy away from pointing out those inconsistencies. She even goes so far as to call it a war on men.
Okay, now that's a pretty loaded term, a war on men. What exactly does she mean by that?
Well, she argues that this framing of gender relations as a power struggle leads to a demonization of men and masculinity.
So she's saying that it creates this climate where men are automatically seen as the enemy, the oppressor, simply by virtue of being male.
Exactly. And she argues that this has created a culture of misandry, where it's become not only acceptable but even fashionable to denigrate and belittle men.
She even links this to the rise in things like male disposability, where men's lives and well-being are seen as less valuable than women's.
Right. And she points to things like the higher rates of male suicide, homelessness, and workplace fatalities as evidence of this. She argues that these issues are often ignored or downplayed because they don't fit the narrative of men as the privileged
It's
oppressors.
a pretty bleak picture she's painting. But then she takes it a step further and says that feminism isn't just hurting men, it's actually betraying women as well.
Yeah, that's one of the most controversial aspects of her argument, but it's also, I think, one of the most important
Hmm.
because she's really challenging the idea that feminism is this monolithic force that speaks for all women.
She's saying that a lot of women are actually feeling alienated and even harmed by the messages and policies coming from the feminist movement.
Right. And she argues that this is because feminism has, in many ways, become disconnected from the lived experiences and desires of real women.
So how does she back that up? What kind of evidence does she present to support this claim?
Well, one of the things she points to is the way feminism often portrays motherhood as a burden or a trap.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense that women who choose to prioritize family over career are somehow less than or making a mistake.
Right, and she argues that this kind of messaging ignores the very real fulfillment and joy that many women find in motherhood. She also points out that this pressure to prioritize career often leads to women delaying motherhood until it becomes more difficult or even impossible.
So she's saying that feminism, in its attempt to liberate women, has actually ended up limiting their choices and creating new forms of pressure and anxiety.
That's one way to put it. And she also argues that this focus on individual achievement and career success has led to a decline in the importance of family and community.
Which then ties back to that whole issue of social breakdown and isolation that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And she sees this as a direct consequence of the feminist push for individualism and autonomy, which she argues has come at the expense of traditional values and social bonds.
Okay, so we've got this idea that feminism has become more about power than equality, and that it's actually hurting both men and women in the process. But where does this shift come from? What does she see as the root cause of this problem?
Well, she points to what she calls the feminist Marxist alliance, this idea that feminism and Marxism have, in many ways, converged to create a movement that's fundamentally opposed to traditional values and institutions.
Dismantle Western civilization. That's a pretty loaded statement. Can you elaborate on that a bit? What exactly does she see as the goals of this alliance?
Well, she argues that they both share this vision of a society that's completely restructured, where traditional hierarchies and power structures are abolished. And she sees this as a utopian fantasy that ignores the realities of human nature and the complexities of social organization.
So she's saying that this alliance is actually working to undermine the very foundations of Western society.
That's her argument. And she sees this happening in a lot of different areas, from the family to education to the legal system.
Okay, so we're starting to get a sense of the scope of her critique here.
Yeah.
But before we dive into those specifics, I want to go back to this idea of a feminist Marxist alliance. I think it's important to unpack what she means by that.
Yeah, it's definitely a term that needs some unpacking, because it can sound kind of conspiratorial if you don't understand the historical and ideological context she's drawing on.
Right, so let's break it down. What exactly does she mean by feminist and Marxist in this context? And how does she see those two ideologies coming together?
Well, I think it's important to remember that she's not talking about all feminists or all Marxists. She's specifically targeting what she sees as the most radical and ideologically driven elements within both movements.
So she's not saying that every feminist is a Marxist or vice versa, but that there's a certain overlap in their goals and tactics.
Exactly. And she traces this back to the influence of second-wave feminism, which emerged in the 1960s and drew heavily on Marxist ideas about class struggle and oppression.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection here. So she's saying that this kind of radical feminist ideology has absorbed some of the core tenets of Marxism, specifically the idea that society is divided into oppressors and the oppressed.
Yeah. And that the solution is to overthrow the oppressors and create a new society based on equality.
Which in this case translates to men being the oppressors and women being the oppressed.
Right. And she argues that this framing has led to a lot of the problems she outlines in the book, like the demonization of men, the devaluation of traditional gender roles, and the breakdown of the family.
Okay, so that gives us a bit more context for understanding this feminist Marxist alliance that she's talking about. But how does this play out in the real world? How does she see this alliance actually impacting our lives and institutions?
Well, that's what we'll be exploring in the rest of this deep dive, because she goes into a lot of detail about how she sees this ideology influencing everything from the education system to the legal system to the media.
So we've got a lot more to unpack here.
Yeah.
But I think we've laid a good foundation for understanding the core of Riker's argument.
And I think it's important to remember as we move forward that her book is meant to be a provocation. It's meant to challenge our assumptions and make us think critically about these issues.
Exactly. And whether you agree with her conclusions or not, I think it's undeniable that she raises some important questions about the direction our society is heading. Questions that we need to be having open and honest conversations about.
Absolutely. And that's what we're here to do. So let's dive in. So one of the key areas where Riker sees this playing out is in the family court system.
Yeah, she dedicates a whole chapter to that, right? She really goes in depth on how she sees the family court system as being biased against men.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of men, this is where the rubber really meets the road, because this is where they're seeing the impact of these ideological shifts in a very real and often very painful way.
It's not just theoretical anymore. It's about custody battles, child support payments, and sometimes even false accusations.
Right. And Riker argues that the system is often stacked against men from the start.
Like she talks about how men are often presumed guilty until proven innocent, especially in cases involving allegations of domestic violence.
Yeah, and she points to the fact that men are often ordered to pay child support even when paternity is disputed.
And she doesn't just focus on the legal aspects of it either. She also talks about the emotional toll this takes on men.
Yeah, she highlights how the emotional impact of custody decisions on fathers is rarely considered. Like, these guys are losing their kids, they're being separated from their families, and often they're being portrayed as the villains.
And she argues that this is all happening within a system that's supposed to be about protecting children's best interests.
Right, and she questions whether that's really what's happening in many cases.
She even goes so far as to say that the family court system is often more concerned with punishing men than it is with actually helping families.
Which is a pretty damning indictment, and it's one that I think a lot of men who've been through this system would agree with.
Okay, so that's the family court system. But she also talks about how this war on men is playing out in other areas of society as well, right?
Oh yeah, she goes into a lot of different areas. Like, she talks about the way men are portrayed in the media.
Yeah, that was a really interesting chapter. She basically argues that the media is constantly bombarding us with negative stereotypes of men.
Like the bumbling dad trope in sitcoms, or the overrepresentation of male villains in movies.
Exactly. And she argues that this is all part of a deliberate effort to undermine masculinity and make men look bad.
And she points out that this can have a real impact on how men are perceived and treated in society.
Like she talks about how this kind of negative portrayal can contribute to things like misandry and discrimination against men.
And it can also make it harder for men to speak out about the issues they're facing because they're afraid of being ridiculed or dismissed.
So it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle, right? The more the media portrays man in a negative light, the more people come to believe those stereotypes, and the harder it becomes for men to challenge those stereotypes.
Exactly. And Riker sees this as a very dangerous trend.
And then there's that whole thing about toxic masculinity, which she really takes issue with.
Yeah, she argues that this term has become so overused and so broadly defined that it's basically lost all meaning.
Like she says, it's become this catch-all phrase for anything that people don't like about men.
Right. And she argues that it's actually doing more harm than good because it's pathologizing normal male behavior.
Like she gives the example of men being told to be more in touch with their emotions.
But then when they do express their emotions, they're often ridiculed or accused of being weak.
So they're damned if they do and damned if they don't.
Exactly. And she argues that this creates a really confusing and damaging double bind for men.
And she also points out that this whole focus on toxic masculinity often ignores the very real problems that men are facing.
Like the higher rates of male suicide that we were talking about earlier.
Right. She argues that instead of addressing those issues head on, we're too busy blaming them on toxic masculinity.
Which isn't actually helping anyone.
Okay, so we've talked about the family court system, the media, and toxic masculinity. But I know she also goes into some other areas where she sees this war on men playing out.
Yeah, she talks about education, for example.
She argues that boys are being disadvantaged in the education system.
Right. She points to things like the fact that boys are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD and more likely to be disciplined in school.
And she argues that this is partly because the education system is becoming increasingly feminized.
Yeah, she talks about how schools are often more focused on girls' needs and learning styles and that boys are being left behind.
And she also points out that this is happening at a time when boys are already struggling in a lot of areas.
Like, she cites the statistics about how boys are falling behind girls in terms of educational attainment and college enrollment.
And she argues that this is a real crisis that we need to be paying attention to.
Because it's not just about boys, it's about the future of our society. If we're not raising boys to be successful and well-adjusted, it's going to have a ripple effect on everyone.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it's one that often gets overlooked in these conversations.
And then there's the whole issue of male role models.
She argues that boys are growing up without positive male role models.
Yeah, she talks about how fathers are often absent from the home and how the media is constantly portraying men in a negative light.
And she argues that this is leaving boys without a clear sense of what it means to be a good man.
Right, and she sees this as a major contributing factor to a lot of the problems that men are facing.
Like violence, crime, and even mental health issues.
Exactly. She argues that if we want to solve these problems, we need to start by giving boys positive male role models to look up to.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. And it's clear that Riker sees this war on men, as a very real and very serious problem. But does she offer any solutions? Does she see any way out of this mess?
She does, and that's what we'll be talking about in part 3. So, one of the things that Riker really emphasizes is the importance of personal responsibility.
Okay, so she's saying that even though men might be facing all these systemic challenges and biases, they still have a role to play in their own lives.
Exactly. She's not letting men off the hook. She's not saying that they're just victims of circumstance, but she is saying that they need to take ownership of their own choices and actions.
So it's about empowering men to be proactive in shaping their own destinies, rather than just reacting to the forces around them.
Right. And she talks a lot about the importance of self-improvement, things like developing your skills, pursuing your passions, taking care of your physical and mental health.
So it's not just about fighting against the system, it's about building yourself up as an individual.
Exactly. And she argues that this is ultimately more empowering than just complaining about how unfair the world is.
So it's about taking control of the things you can control, rather than focusing on the things you can't.
Right. And, she also talks about the importance of finding purpose and meaning in your life.
Okay, so that's personal responsibility, but she also talks about the importance of community, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. She sees community as being essential for men's well-being.
And she's not just talking about any kind of community. She's specifically talking about men's communities, right?
Right. She argues that men need to connect with other men who share their values and who can provide support and encouragement.
She sees this as being especially important in a society where men are often feeling isolated and alienated.
Yeah, she talks about how men are often discouraged from expressing their emotions or from being vulnerable with each other.
And she argues that this can lead to a lot of emotional repression and unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Right, and she sees men's communities as a way to counter that by providing a safe and supportive space for men to be themselves.
So it's about creating a brotherhood where men can connect with each other on a deeper level.
Exactly, and she also talks about the importance of mentorship.
Having older men who can guide and advise younger men.
Right, she sees mentorship as being crucial for helping young men navigate the challenges of manhood.
Especially in a society where traditional rites of passage and models of masculinity are kind of breaking down.
Exactly. She argues that mentorship can provide young men with the guidance and support they need to develop into strong and confident adults.
So it's about passing on the wisdom and experience of one generation to the next.
Right, and she sees this as being vital for preserving the best aspects of masculinity.
Okay, so we've got personal responsibility, community, mentorship, and she also talks about the importance of fatherhood.
Right. Oh, yeah. She dedicates a whole chapter to that. She really sees fatherhood as being crucial, not just for men's well-being, but for the well-being of society as a whole.
And she argues that fatherhood has been devalued in recent decades.
Right. She talks about how the role of the father has been minimized in both culture and law.
Like she talks about how fathers are often portrayed as being incompetent or irrelevant in the media.
Yeah, and she points to things like the high rates of fatherlessness as evidence of how damaging this trend is.
And she argues that this is having a devastating impact on children.
Right. She cites studies showing that children who grow up without fathers are more likely to experience a whole range of problems like poverty, crime, and mental health issues.
And she sees this as being a major societal crisis.
Exactly. And she argues that we need to start valuing fatherhood again if we want to solve these problems.
So it's about recognizing the essential role that fathers play in their children's lives.
Right. And it's about creating a culture that supports and encourages involved fatherhood.
And she also talks about the importance of men stepping up and being good fathers.
Yeah, she's not just blaming society, she's also calling on men to take responsibility for their role as fathers.
So it's about men being present, being involved, and being good role models for their children.
Exactly, and she argues that this is one of the most important things that men can do to make a positive difference in the world.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here with Riker's book. We've talked about her critiques of modern feminism. We've explored the war on men that she sees playing out in various aspects of society. And we've delved into some of the solutions that she proposes. It's been a thought-provoking and challenging discussion, to say the least.
It definitely has. And, whether you agree with all of her conclusions or not, I think it's undeniable that she raises some really important questions about gender, relationships, and the direction our society is heading.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this book so valuable. It forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths and to think critically about the narratives that we've been told.
And, at the end of the day, I think that's what Riker's really calling for, a more honest and open conversation about these issues.
A conversation that's based on mutual respect, understanding, and a genuine desire to find solutions that work for everyone.
Exactly, because ultimately we're all in this together. And we need to find a way to move forward in a way that benefits both men and women.
Well said. And if you're interested in exploring these ideas further, you can find Feminist Chaos on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
It's definitely a book that will stay with you long after you finish reading it.
And as always, we encourage you to continue the conversation. Share your thoughts, your questions, and your own experiences with us in the comments, because this is a conversation that needs to keep happening.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep thinking critically and keep challenging the status quo.